Welcome to It's Your Dime, a straight talk interview series presented by SchiffGold. I'm your host, Mike Maharrey. In this episode, I'll be talking to Eric Peters about the auto market and the Green New Deal. Eric is known as the Libertarian car guy, but you'll want to hear this conversation even if you're not a gearhead. We talk about the auto mandates and the Green New Deal, the practical feasibility of electric cars, how government fatwas have distorted the automobile market, the increasing level of auto loan defaults, why it's happening and what it means down the road, and the nanny state and its impact on the auto market. Well, I'm here today with Eric Peters of Eric Peters Autos, a fantastic website that if you're not checking out on a regular basis, you probably should be. Eric, thank you so much for taking a little bit of time to talk to me today.
Oh, you bet. Glad to be here.
All right, well, so we're going to start the interview like I start all of these It's Your Dime interviews with the, I like to call this little segment, Who Are You and Why Are You on My Show? So this is basically just your opportunity to kind of give us a little bit of your background, who you are, where you're coming from, and what exactly you do.
Well, I'm kind of an off-the-reservation car jockey journalist, if that makes any sense. Many moons ago, I used to write for mainstream media outlets, including the Chicago Tribune and Washington Times, Car Connection, Cars.com, and all of that. I launched my own website, was about 10 years ago, and ever since then have been sort of my own one-man shop, which is great because it really allows me to write about things freely that previously I was not free to write about, including not just things like car reviews, but how our mobility is related to our freedom, and that has become a focus of my writing.
Yeah, it really comes through, and like I said before we actually were formally doing the interview, I love your work. And I'm not really a gearhead. I'm not a car guy. I drive around in an old BMW. It gets me from point A to point B. But I discovered you listening to the Tom Woods show, and he kind of made that same pitch. You know, you don't have to be a car person to really enjoy what you're doing. And if you're somebody who cares about liberty, freedom, economics, you cover all of those topics in a fantastic way. So I encourage everybody to check out what you're doing and your work. The first thing that I kind of want to touch on today is something that's obviously big in the news right now, and that's this insane Green New Deal that was announced formally. And of course, automobiles are wrapped up in the Green New Deal. And one of the provisions that's pretty prominent is this idea that we're going to go completely to EVs in, I think it's 10 years is what they're saying, which to me sounds a little bit crazy. Just from your perspective as a car guy, I mean, let's just pretend for a minute we buy the whole thing, that we're in this crisis and this is absolutely necessary. Is it even feasible to go to EVs in 10 years?
Well, it's feasible, I suppose. It's feasible to do almost anything. It would be feasible to shut down the whole economy, I guess.
Right.
If you wanted to do that, the question is it desirable? And you know, my premise, my fundamental point with regard to EVs is simply this. If they made such sense, if they were a superior alternative to non-electric cars in terms of things like cost of ownership, cost to drive, practicality, and so on, then it would not be necessary to mandate their manufacture and subsidize their purchase. I think that's extremely telling. In the field of economics, generally speaking, you don't need to put a gun in somebody's belly if it's a good idea. If it's of value, people will naturally gravitate in that direction. I have nothing against EVs as such, even though I'm often accused of that. What I've got a big problem with, though, is the government trying to force them down our throats via the mandates and the subsidies.
Yeah, I feel like from a layperson's perspective in terms of EVs, I mean, you know, I'm with you. I don't have a problem with the idea or the concept of it. To me, it's just, I can't picture how this would be practical for me in my daily life to utilize this vehicle. I mean, it would work for me, you know? And so you're right, it does have to be mandated and whatnot. One of the things, you wrote an article that not too long ago that I thought was really interesting, and this was in the midst of the Great Polar Vortex, and you pointed out the fact that, you know, your battery dies, you've got no heat. Can you kind of expand on just that one practical aspect to kind of give people an idea of where we are on the technology with these things right now?
Well, sure, and it's actually rather interesting because this was the first moment, as far as I'm aware, that the general media actually began to cover this issue. I've been writing about it for several years.
Oh, yeah.
In an electric car, this is going to sound pretty obvious, but apparently it's not. Everything that is powered in an electric car is powered by the battery, right? Well, that includes things like your heater and also your air conditioner. And when it's very cold outside, those accessories draw a tremendous amount of power. And that creates a compounding problem because the battery is also supposed to power the car, make it move. Well, if you've lost 10 or 20% of the range as a result of using the heat when it's minus 20 degrees outside, and the range of the car was only 100 miles, let's say, to begin with, you got a problem.
Right.
And then you've got another problem. In a car that's not electric, you can refuel to full in literally less than 5 minutes. It's extraordinarily convenient. You don't have to plan ahead. There are gas stations everywhere. Roll up to the pump, fill up, and you're back on your way, and you've got several hundred miles, even in a so-called gas pig SUV. You've got several hundred miles of range now. Now, with an electric car, and a lot of people don't know this, due to the nature of battery chemistry, at these so-called fast chargers, and I always put that in quotes
right.
and italicize it for the irony of it, you're looking at a minimum of 30 to 45 minutes to recover approximately 80% of the charge. And the reason for that is that if you attempt to put a full charge into the battery at a fast charger, potentially you can damage the battery. So that's why the onboard electronics will limit the recharge to just 80%. So you start out with, say, 150 miles of range, as in the case of a Nissan Leaf. Now your range is down to 80% of that, and it's very cold out, so you use the heat, and the heat takes another 10 or 20% off of it. Who wants that? Does that make any sense to you?
It makes zero sense to me. I don't like being cold in the first place.
No, most people don't like being cold. And then, you get into other peripherals. The Leaf is essentially equivalent in terms of what it is, if you leave aside the fact that it's electrically powered, to something like a Nissan Versa in terms of its size, in terms of its amenities and so forth. Well, the Leaf has a sticker price of $30,000.
Right.
Now, you can get into a Versa sedan for, I think, about $14,000. So you're looking at twice the cost to get into this Leaf that goes half as far, that takes a minimum, if you can find a fast charger, of 30 to 45 minutes to recover 80% of its 150-mile best-case range. Now you know why you have to have mandates and subsidies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and, like I said, the thought that went through my head, especially as I was reading these articles, I pictured myself, trying to get to, say, my kids actually live about an hour away. So trying to get to my kid's house, getting in a traffic jam in my battery-powered car, and running out of juice in the middle of the interstate when it's 20 below zero. That's not a scenario that, yeah, exactly. That's not a scenario that I want to be in. And you've made the point too. We have all of these, these safety mandates because the government cares so much about our safety, and yet this is one of those things that doesn't sound particularly safe in that situation.
No, it's extremely unsafe. And by the way, while we're on that topic, it's interesting that EVs get a pass with regard to things that would be unacceptable with non-electric cars. In an electric car, you've got this battery pack. It's actually not batteries per se. It's a pack of batteries, and they're spread out generally along the entire floor pan of the vehicle. Now, the problem with that is that if the vehicle is in an impact from any direction, that case is potentially going to get damaged. And if the battery case is damaged and the internal structure of the battery is compromised, that alone can trigger a very, very serious fire. Whereas with a regular car, you've got the gas tank that's located in one part of the car, generally around the rear axle area. So you have to hit the car in that particular place, in the first place, to cause damage to the tank. And even if the tank is ruptured and leaks, it takes an external spark, an ignition source, to ignite the fuel. The fuel can leak, but the leak doesn't necessarily become a fire.
Yeah, that reminds me of the brouhaha over the Pinto. That was... I was not
Which,
very
by the way,
old
was actually a pretty safe car statistically.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting the way statistics are used. Shall we say? What's the word I'm looking for?
It's disingenuous. If you have an agenda, you can manipulate things to make a case, a dishonest case to the public. And I've been ranting and screaming into the wind now for several years about electric cars, about the fact that the media, in my opinion, has been derelict in not explaining to people these are significant, objective, functional problems with electric cars. Yet they're being portrayed as sort of a miracle gadget, like your new cell phone, that is going to do all these wonderful and great things. But they're not telling people about the fact that you use the heater, use the air conditioner,
right,
and the range declines not just a little bit, but a lot.
So as you've been hammering on this subject, what's the reaction that you've gotten from the mainstream?
Well, at first, they would just simply dismiss me as a hater, much in the way that anybody who questions the whole climate change thing is a denier. As
right.
You're made equivalent to a Holocaust denier. That's the package deal that they're trying to create there. But I find that lately, it's interesting. The wheel seems to be turning a little bit. I find that more and more in the general press, the things that I've been writing about are beginning to percolate, and they're being talked about, including by other guys who review cars like I do. There's a colleague of mine, Paul Eisenstein, who actually wrote about this during the polar vortex. He was reviewing an electric car. I can't recall which model. But he pointed out, he wrote in his review about the effect of the cold and the use of the accessories. And by the way, it's not just heat. It's the defroster.
Right.
It's the headlights. It's the windshield wiper. It's everything that's powered by electricity on the vehicle's range.
It's interesting. Let's pivot a little bit, because you write a lot about. I love the term you use. You call them fatwas, which essentially is what they are, and we see these in a lot of areas of the auto industry, from the emissions and the environmental stuff to, as we've already kind of touched on, safety. How much has this really distorted the auto market in terms of what the consumer would really want to buy and what we are offered by the industry?
Well, it's distorted it along the lines of Frankenstein's monster. The biggest one is probably something called CAFE, and that's an acronym for Corporate Average Fuel Economy. And that is the federal government requirement that each manufacturer's fleet of cars average a certain number of miles per gallon collectively. And that has put tremendous pressure on the car companies to design their vehicles to meet the government's specifications rather than the market specifications. CAFE first began to go into effect in the 70s, and back then, the typical American car that most people drove was a fairly large rear-wheel drive sedan or even a station wagon that could easily accommodate a family of 5 or 6 people. Well, CAFE effectively regulated that type of vehicle out of existence. The only large sedans that you'll find anymore in the new car market are highly, highly expensive, top-of-the-line cars like a BMW 7 Series, Mercedes S-Class, vehicles like that. So they've been essentially denied to the average person. Well, at the time in the 70s, there was a regulatory loophole, a different standard for what were called light trucks. They were subject to a lesser CAFE standard.
Right.
Somebody figured out, hey, you know what? We could take a pickup truck, and we could enclose the bed, and we could essentially build the same thing that we were building before, a fairly big vehicle with a powerful engine, but it's jacked up now and it's got four-wheel drive, and we'll call it an SUV.
Right.
And the Ford Explorer was the first of those. And people loved it, because they didn't want to drive the little downsized front-wheel drive cars that they've been trying to be, the government was trying to force them into, and they saw this alternative, and they jumped on it. And so now we've got this completely distorted marketplace where almost everybody is driving some type of SUV or what are called crossover SUVs, which are designed to look like SUVs, same type of vehicle.
Right.
So that's just one example of how the government has grossly distorted what the market would otherwise have brought us.
It's interesting because on the one hand, you see the negatives of that. On the other hand, you also see how the market oftentimes manages to find a way, despite all of the efforts of government to control it. People figure out how to. Of course, the more they clamp down, the more difficult that gets. But it is interesting that that people find ways around these fatwas whenever they possibly can.
They do. Well, and there are ironies here. One irony is that in the name of saving gas, the government incentivized the production of vehicles that are heavier and less aerodynamic, and because of things like four-wheel drive and because of the types of tires that they have, are much less fuel efficient than a big sedan would have been. Believe it or not, some of the big sedans that were on the market until fairly recently, for example, the Ford Crown Victoria, a lot of cops used to use the Ford Crown Vic.
Yeah, I remember that.
That car was capable of 30 miles per gallon on the highway. Good luck finding a V8 SUV that can do that.
Right. Well, good luck finding a V8.
Yeah, and the fundamental question here, and I harp on this a lot, but I think it's important. we supposedly live in a free country. Why is the government involved in dictating fuel economy at all? If people want highly fuel-efficient cars, the market would respond to that and build fuel-efficient cars. It stands contrary to reason to take the position that the evil, malignant car industry is going to build vehicles that people don't want because they don't want to make money. If the money were in these really small, hyper-fuel-efficient cars, the car industry would fall all over itself because of natural market forces to build them.
Yeah, and that's true of the EV as well. I mean, just going back to that subject.
Yeah, and you would talk about another very interesting distortion with regard to EVs. Initially, the whole point of the electric car was to reduce the cost of getting around. It was a response to high gas prices.
Right.
Well, the government, by creating all of these subsidies and mandates, incentivized the building of cars like the Tesla, which emphasize not economy, but high performance, luxury, and gadgetry. So now that has become the template. So, what we've got essentially are high performance luxury sport cars that happen to be electrically powered. The least expensive new electric car that you can buy is that Nissan Leaf that we were talking about, and that's $30,000 for what is essentially a little compact economy car.
So to put that in simple terms, basically what we've got is we've got the government taking money from all of us to subsidize rich people's toys.
Pretty much. Yeah, exactly. I'd like to have a Porsche 911 Turbo. I've always wanted one.
Oh, yeah, me too.
But I don't get a $7,500 rebate, if I go down to the Porsche store to buy one.
Right.
So I don't understand why somebody who goes out and buys the same basic thing, it just happens to be powered by electricity, is able to dip his hands in my pocket and your pocket and force us to, I use air quotes again, help him subsidize his purchase.
Well, we're saving the environment, so I guess you can sleep better at night knowing that, right?
But you know what? We're not even doing that, and on two levels. On two levels. First of all, the electricity in this country, for the most part, is produced by utility plants that run on natural gas, oil, or coal.
Right.
So, there have been studies that I've read that say that in the aggregate, overall, while the emissions coming out of the tailpipe, because the electric car doesn't have one, are maybe lower or non-existent, in the aggregate, in the whole, it's very debatable whether these cars, in fact, have any environmental benefit, even if you accept the whole climate change thing.
Right.
That's point one. And point two, because the emphasis now is on high performance, you hear Elon Musk and Tesla people constantly talk about how their car can get to, the Tesla S can get to 60 in 2.9 seconds. Well, that's great. But because, in order to get to 60 in 2.9 seconds, it requires considerably more energy, and energy doesn't come out of the vacuum for free.
Right.
So if you had an electric car that maybe got to 60 in the time that a Prius gets there, you probably have an electric car that used half or even a third less energy.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because it kind of illuminates the way costs are hidden in, especially when the government gets involved in things. Because when we go put a gallon of gas in the car, we see exactly how much that costs us. We swipe the card, we see the numbers on the gas tank. When we go plug a car into an electrical outlet, we don't directly see the cost of that electricity. It does in your head. It's almost like it's free. It's kind of like the way they do taxes. We get this tax refund, and they take the taxes out of our checks. We never see it. We don't realize how much money we're paying in taxes. And it's interesting the way the government kind of hides these costs from us.
Yeah, and here's another thing that the general press has not been discussing with regard to hiding the true cost of electricity. Right now, I think roughly, about 25% of the cost of every gallon of gas that you buy is motor fuel taxes, state, federal level, local taxes. Right. There are, as yet, no motor fuels taxes applied to the kilowatt-hour cost of electricity.
That's true.
So it's very dishonest, because how are we going to maintain the roads? You always hear people on the left talk about, well, what about the roads? How are we going to maintain the roads? Well, the roads are maintained largely by these pay-as-you-go motor fuels vehicle taxes that you pay every time you fill up your car. But the electric vehicle owner currently pays absolutely no motor fuels taxes, so they're essentially getting a free ride, and that's going to have to stop, or the roads are going to disintegrate. They're going to have to find some way to replace the motor fuels tax, and they're probably going to do that by a mileage tax that will be applied, according to your odometer reading every year.
Ugh. That sounds lovely.
Yep. But again, it's disingenuous because the real cost of the electricity is being masked. People are at this moment, because they're trying to push and incentivize these electric cars. They're essentially allowing people, and I don't like to use that word, of course, but nonetheless, they're allowing people to get this free ride with electricity, and that way people will think, oh, look at all the money I'm saving. It only costs me X amount to charge my electric car each month. Yeah, for now, but just wait until they apply the equivalent taxes, and then it's not going to be such a bargain.
Right. That's Bastiat's what's seen and unseen, and we like to look at what is seen and ignore the unseen. So while we're on the subject of distortions, you've probably seen this news that came out last week. More than 7 million Americans have fallen at least 90 days delinquent on auto loans. Yeah. We're 1 million higher than the previous peak, which was back in 2010, and people remember 2010 as basically being the height of the Great Recession. Yeah. So kind of from your point of view, reading the car industry, what has caused, first off, the skyrocketing number of auto loans? How has that distorted the financing of automobiles, and kind of where do you see this going?
Well, right now the average new car loan is 6 to 7 years, which is roughly a doubling of what it had been historically. If you went back to the 70s and I think even into the 80s, the typical new car loan was about 3 or 4 years. So because the cost of cars has increased significantly since that time for a variety of reasons, they've had to push these loans out farther and farther to make it somewhat feasible for people to be able to manage that debt load. The problem is that as you push that loan farther and farther out, the depreciation starts to be your number one enemy. Right. Most cars lose about 10 to 15% of their value each year from the time that you roll off that dealer's lot. So that by the time you're at 6 or 7 years, your vehicle is probably worth not even half what you paid for it anymore. And you're looking at this big note and thinking, gee, I'm paying, you're underwater. As we used to talk about in the real estate business back during the 08 crash, people think, well, it doesn't make any sense for me to continue to pay on this thing because it's not worth what I still owe on it. Right. And so rationally, it may not be moral, but rationally they make the decision to just walk away from the debt and default.
Yeah, another thing that's interesting about it too is you mentioned real estate. There's an increasingly large subprime auto market, and they're actually bundling these things together just like they did with the mortgage securities, which is interesting. From what I was reading, a lot of what we're seeing right now, and I think between you and me, I think this is the beginning of, I think we're heading into a recessionary period, and I think this is kind of the canary in the coal mine, but most of this is in that subprime market where you're seeing the delinquencies and the defaults right now. But, it's like housing, it's just a matter of time before it proliferates into the broader market and then the broader economy.
That's right. Now, the interesting thing is you don't necessarily have to go into or buy into a mountain of debt to buy a new car. The statistic that's touted, which is true, is that the cost of the average new car is about $35,000 now. That's what people are buying. However, you can still buy cars. I had a Mitsubishi Mirage that I reviewed a couple of weeks ago that you can pick up for about $13,000. The thing is that the credit lending standards now are almost non-existent, and they'll write a loan for pretty much anybody. Sound familiar? Just like they did back during the housing thing. So people are being incentivized to purchase vehicles that they really can't afford because they want all those gadgets and also all this safety stuff, both the things that are mandated by the government and which people have been, in my opinion, gulled into believing they absolutely have to have. So, they're enamored of all the big touch screens and the technology, and rather than buy the sensible car at $13,000 or $14,000 that they could afford and they could manage, they go out and buy the $35,000 car, and they find that it's too much and it overwhelms them. And anything that goes wrong in their life, they lose their job or they have some expense that comes up and they can't make the payment.
Yeah, and that dovetails with actually my next question, because I drive a 1997 car on purpose because I don't want all of the safety standards. Now, a lot of times I travel a lot for business, and usually when I do that, I rent a car. Mainly because I don't want to drive a car with 250,000 miles on it long distances. But so you get the newer, I get to quote unquote test drive a lot of newer cars that I rent. I absolutely despise these lane departure warnings. And I was trying to drive, I think it was a Toyota Corolla, and I couldn't figure out how to turn it off. So anytime I put cruise control, once I got within, like, I don't know, way farther than I wanted to, it started slowing the car down. And it made it difficult to even pass. You had to turn off the cruise control in order to pass.
Yeah.
Kind of talk a little bit, and you write a lot about this, but so maybe kind of summarize all of this I guess nanny state stuff that we're seeing in cars, and how can we avoid some of that stuff?
Well, unfortunately, we can't avoid a lot of it because it's been mandated by the government, which again has taken it upon itself to design cars on our behalf and talk about that as being for safety. But that has to be defined a little bit. We're not talking about cars that are unsafe to drive. We're simply talking about whether they meet various crash-worthiness standards. So, in other words, the car isn't necessarily going to get into an accident, but if you get into an accident, it may be more or less able to absorb the impact in that crash. So, the Volkswagen Beetle that I drove when I first started working after college was horrifically unsafe according to federal standards, but it was perfectly safe for me. I never crashed it. It was a great car for me. I loved that car. So, that's really what we're talking about here. And the presumption behind all of it is it's reactive. It assumes that everybody is addled, incompetent, inept, and therefore we have to make the cars, on presumption, on the certainty that they're going to be crashed. And so we have to keep whoever the person is from dying from his own incompetence behind the wheel, rather than encouraging people to be attentive and competent and responsible drivers, in my opinion. And one consequence of this, unfortunately, this unintended consequence, is that you've got all these new distractions in the car. The car's beeping at you constantly, or it's flashing a light at you, or it's actively preempting you, as in the case of the thing that you mentioned, the lane keep assist, or me too, or the automated emergency braking. That's another one. It'll just jam on the brakes when there's no need for the car to brake. And it's very, very, it's disconcerting. You have all of these external things coming at you, and if you're trying to pay attention to your driving, it's increasingly difficult to do that, and in my opinion, that's pretty unsafe.
Yeah, and isn't there really, like any economic equation, isn't there a trade-off between safety and cost and what you as an individual, how you value that safety?
Of course.
For instance, you could make a car that's probably close to 100% safe if it didn't go over 5 miles an hour, but
well, sure,
who's going to drive that? So, and they talk about, like, the safest place in the world, ostensibly, is prison, right? You've got cars that are... So, this is another example, and you harp on this a lot. The fact of the matter is, who is the government to tell us what our level of safety standard is?
Well, and also to make what literally are life and death decisions on our behalf. I'll give you two, I think, good examples. One is there's a federal standard that requires all new cars be able to support their weight on the roof if they roll over in an accident.
Right.
And because of that, you may have noticed if you've been in a new car recently that what are called the A, B, and C pillars, the buttresses that support the roof at either end of the windshield and so on at the back of the car, have become enormously thick relative to what was typical in the past. If you got into a car in the 70s, the 60s, or even into the 80s, those pillars were generally 3-4 maybe inches wide. Now they're often twice that.
Right.
And the result is we have these horrific blind spots.
Yes, we do.
So while the car may be safer if you roll it, it is now much more likely that you are going to get T-boned pulling out of a side street because you couldn't see the car that was coming at you from the opposite lane. That's one very concrete example, and here's another one. Airbags. They were forced down our throats, and we were told, oh, this is going to save lives. Well, the plain objective fact is that they also take lives. Airbags do kill people occasionally.
Yep.
Right now, we've got several 100,000 cars in this country alone that are driving around with known to be defective and potentially lethal Takata airbags. But the government took that decision away from us and decided that it knew best. And I think that's to me an incredibly obnoxious concept that we as free people are having that risk calculation, that cost-benefit equation taken out of our hands as though we were kind of imbecile children and being preempted by these bureaucrats in Washington.
Yeah, the Sightline thing, absolutely. I've experienced that, again, renting cars. I have a hard time. The Sightlines in my 1997 BMW are fantastic. I don't really have any blind spots. But, yeah, I get in some... I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was one of the Chevys I don't remember which one it was, but I had a hard time seeing. And that's why they could say, and then they have to have backup cameras because you can't see out the back window. And
that's right. And the butt of the car now, the tail end of it, you may have noticed this. They're all kind of bulbous and jacked up, and the glass is really small, and that's because of the rear crash bumper impact standards. And so now you can't see behind you, and so now you have to have this federally mandated backup camera so that you don't back up over a kid who happens to be playing behind your car.
Right.
But those cameras actually have terrible views, even the best of them. They don't have depth perception the way that human eye does.
Right.
And also their peripheral vision is inherently limited. You've got a certain field of view, whereas with your eye you can actually look back there and you can see. But now people are encouraged to gape at this little LCD screen and assume it's okay to back up. And it would be almost ironic and like the plot for a bad novel, except it's our actual everyday reality.
Well, speaking of bad novel plots, and we'll kind of wrap up on this final little topic, but you're hearing a lot of talk now about driverless cars and this technology. And I actually read an article the other day it was on a Libertarian site about how great this was. The advent of technology, we're not going to have to drive. To me, it creeps me out, and maybe it's because I'm old. You can call me a troglodyte or whatever, or a Luddite. But and you've written about this too, so that's why I'm kind of bringing this up. You talk about cars being kind of there's a parallel between the automobile and this idea of freedom. And I love the song Red Barchetta by Rush because it kind of captures that. How do you see this driverless car thing? I mean, do you see it as a great boon of technology that's going to free us up, or is it something that's kind of creepy and the government's going to use to keep us in one place?
I think it's horrific. I think people need to be aware. You're talking about. I use the term automated rather than autonomous. You'll generally hear the term autonomous. Well, autonomous to me, if you look at the dictionary, means independent. Right. These cars are not independent. They are controlled by somebody who is not you. So, let that sink in. I personally love the idea if I decide, hey, after we're done talking today, I think I'm going to jump in my car and I'm going to go down to a coffee shop. I can just get in and go, and I can pick whatever route I'd like, and I can go there, on my schedule how I wish. No external force is compelling me and monitoring me and controlling me. And really, that's what you're talking about here in principle with these automated cars. You're talking about surrendering your mobility to, it's not just the government, it's what I call the government-corporate nexus.
Right.
And allowing them to control your movement. And I find that prospect to be enormously creepy, leaving aside any technical objections, of which there are many.
Right. Yeah, I don't, you're probably like me. Sometimes I just like to get in the car and drive. I mean, it's
exactly.
A great way to clear your head. I live in Kentucky, so you can get out on some of these rural roads. It's beautiful. I don't want to not be able to drive, and that's what I see coming. It's not just that it's going to be, you have this option to go in the autonomous car. It's going to be you have to do this, and you're not allowed to own a car.
Right.
That's what I see coming down the track.
Well, yeah, exactly. I see it coming with neon lights flashing. I think that's pretty obvious to anybody who's paying attention. Again, I wouldn't have any issue with this if it were a purely market-driven thing and it were offered to people. For example, older people who can't see well anymore and who can't drive anymore and who are limited in terms of where they can go because they can't drive. I'm sympathetic to that, and I think for that kind of person or a handicapped person, let's say, it would be a boon to be able to have, be able to call up an automated vehicle and have it take them to the supermarket and back. That's great.
Right.
But that's really not what we're talking about here. We're talking, again, as with the electric cars, of this top-down move to kind of just push and force us to use the infamous term of Cass Sunstein, to nudge us with a bayonet in a certain direction. And I think it's high time that we push back against that.
All right, one final question. This is a fun question. Has absolutely nothing to do with cars. But it's a very personal question to me because I'm an editor. I do a lot of editing. When you are typing on a computer, not a typewriter, do you double space after every sentence?
Let me think. I don't. And the reason I don't is because of a style. It was inculcated into my brain, or hardwired into my brain when I first began my journalism career, that there was one space after the conclusion of any sentence after a period.
Bless you. I'll let you come back on my show. The two spaces after the sentence is something that absolutely drives me batty and insane, especially because it doesn't look right on a website. And, of course, it evolved out of typewriters, and because of the way fonts were on typewriters, it actually was necessary to do it. And so a lot of people that are, I'm assuming we're probably pretty close in the same age range. I was born in the early mid-'60s. So people that learn typing, you learn that, and a lot of people have had a hard time breaking that habit. But as an editor, I have to go back and fix all those spaces when I'm putting their stuff on the website. So.
Oh, you've got my sympathy. I'm grateful that I only have to edit my own stuff.
Of course, that can be a challenge. I can't edit myself, so there's that problem as well. So.
Well, neither can I, but luckily I'm pretty, as we say in the journalism business, my stuff is usually pretty clean. I'm pretty good with grammar and spelling. But you're right. It's a bad idea to edit your own stuff. But I can't afford to hire a full-time copy editor.
Right. Well, but the nice thing about it is nobody can fire you either. So
that's right.
That's
exactly
the big
right.
plus. Well, before we cut off, let me give you an opportunity to provide the audience with all of your essential social media sites, your website address, and all of those things. Where can we find Eric Peters?
Well, chiefly at epautos.com, fairly obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my Twitter is also, and it's a little awkward, Libertarian Car G. They wouldn't give me Guy, so I just got G. And that's the preponderance of it. The one thing I would like to mention that people listening may be interested in, we have a little feature on the site that's called Ask Eric, and you'll see the little button at the end of every article. If you have a question about cars, whatever it may be, if you're in the market for a car, or just a repair question or anything like that, I'm happy to answer questions. That's free. There's no money involved. I just do that as a thank you to the people who come to the site.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, and I will encourage people to visit the site. Like I said, even if you're not a huge automobile person, I love the way you write. I like some of the terminology you use. Terms like clover and armed government agent, or armed government employees, and you have a nice way with words that makes your writing very interesting, even if you're not into the whole techie thing of automobiles. So,
well, thanks. We have to have fun. Part of it is important and serious, but you also, I think, need to be entertaining and in order to get something across. If you're boring, people aren't going to read you or listen to you.
Absolutely. Well, again, Eric, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it, and you have a great day.
Thanks, Mike. You also.
You've been watching It's Your Dime, an interview series presented by SchiffGold. For more information on investing in gold and silver, talk to a SchiffGold precious metal specialist today at 1-888-GOLD-160. That's 1-888-465-3160. Or visit us on the web at SchiffGold.com. You can keep up with all of the latest precious metals news at SchiffGold.com/news. And tune in each week to the SchiffGold Friday Gold Wrap podcast. This is your host, Mike Maharrey. I appreciate you watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.